Well, hello, everybody. How's it going? My name is David Parsons, and this is the Nostalgia Trap podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. The conversation I have for you today is with Carolyn Eisenberg. She is a professor of history at Hofstra University, and I met her while working at the New York Historical Society on a big exhibition on the Vietnam War that will be coming out this fall. And she was a voice in the room among a number of scholars that I loved listening to her. She has stories from being at Columbia University during the 1968 strike, and she's been writing a book on Nixon for a while that I think she's finishing up now. And she just has a kind of remarkable take on all of that stuff. I particularly enjoy this conversation because we talked a lot about the intersection of politics and teaching, which is something obviously I've thought a lot about as someone who is on the left and thinks of myself as a very radical political person, but also, a teacher and someone who has to communicate ideas and help students learn content and skills and all that kind of stuff. And how those things intersect is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about and even talking about on the show, but this was a more explicit conversation about that. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Carolyn Eisenberg, and you can find more Nostalgia Trap conversations at nostalgiatrap.com. And if you would be kind enough to donate to the show, you can do so at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Subscribers are getting bonus episodes very soon, and I know that many of the subscribers who gave me their address have already gotten some Nostalgia Trap items in the mail, and there are more buttons and stickers on the way. I think the next button I'm making right now that's on the way and will be available to subscribers soon is something that everyone's going to like. So I'll leave it at that. Please enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Professor of History, Carolyn Eisenberg. So thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's really a pleasure to do this.
I was just telling you, and I wanted to repeat this, that a lot of the talk on this show is about graduate school and about our experiences in graduate school. And my experience was to be in graduate school in New York City during the Bush years, during the George W. Bush years and the Iraq War and all that, 9/11. And that stuff, that being in studying American history at the same time as those events going on really, shaped my politics and shaped the way I look at history, etc. And so looking at your biography, you went to graduate school, and I know I want to go back further than that, but you went to graduate school during a very, very ripe era in American history, during the late 60s, right?
Right. So I was I was at Columbia from 1967 to 1971. And so that was a time, as you know, was a very dramatic period. And,
there's
the Vietnam War.
That's the strike is in there, right?
The strike is in there. And, it was also the time of U.S. invasion of Cambodia.
That's right.
And then in 1971, that was really when the veterans movement, became visible. It didn't start then, but, there was a big
Winter
demonstration.
Soldier investigation. And
then the demonstrations in Washington in April of 71. And then, all of that time, it was obviously, coincided with a war that at that time felt like it was never going to end. The American part of it was never going to end.
Yeah.
At the time that I finished Columbia, it seemed like it was still going to go on forever.
Well, that's how the wars feel now.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's odd because it feels like, and maybe this is, I don't know if this is true or not, and you can tell me, but see, it feels like Vietnam was not as much on the front pages, and by the time you get to the mid 70s, but it seems like it's falling away. That's the kind of perspective from someone who didn't live through that era. Is that 1968 is always seen as this kind of like peak of Vietnam interest, at least in terms of the American public, and then it kind of drops off.
Not really. I think that, it just seems that way because you get so much more publicity now about 68.
Yeah.
So that's what creates the impression. But there was front page coverage really for that entire period from 1968 to 1971, and the level of protest was very high, really through that entire time. It took a lot of different forms, but it was certainly very vibrant period in terms of peace activism. it doesn't really drop. I mean, when things drop off is really after the United States signs the Paris Agreement in January of '73, and that effectively ended the American part of the war. And at that point, the relatively little attention was being paid, and that's when the peace movement really began to shrink, because then you were really talking about a war that was being fought by proxies or in other places.
What were you studying at Columbia during all of this?
Well, this is kind of odd. I mean, I was doing 20th century U.S. history, but I had sort of an odd career that no graduate student listening should pay any attention to whatsoever. Because at that time, when I went to graduate school at Columbia, I didn't exactly have in my mind, a career. And I just thought we'd be a student forever. And money wasn't such a big issue. Our apartment in Riverside Drive cost $130, so that wasn't a big problem. So it was kind of like you were going there to sort of learn about whatever interested you. So I was broadly speaking in the 20th century, but in fact, what I ended up doing my master's on was the parents' movement at IS 201 and the turn in the civil rights movement from community control, from integration to community control, how the civil rights movement had changed. And really, why did I do that? Well, it wasn't like I was planning this career as an urban somebody or other. It was really because when I was at Chicago as an undergrad, there was a lot of civil rights activity in the city, especially around schools. And I had been involved with CORE and other, projects. So when in New York, the movement that had been focused on integration switched, and of course it paralleled what was happening nationally as far as Black Power, I thought, well, gee, I'd really like to know about that. Yeah. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to write my master's thesis on this topic because it interests me. And plus, it had the particular advantage that then I could also be out of Columbia and I could go spend time in Harlem and talk to other people and just have a broader world. Which, so that was really my master's thesis. And then, and this is why no one should listen or pay any attention. I took the longest time ever to do this master's thesis. And consequently, and I was then going to write a PhD with Richard Hofstadter on foreign policy. But then somebody pointed out to him that I had taken forever on my master's thesis, and it was really long. And so he actually looked at it, and he said, well, you know what, this could be a PhD.
So there you go.
So I'm the only person in I think 2 other people had it. So I then spent 6 more months, and then I just made up my PhD thesis. And that's why I was done in 4 years. But, it was all in a very different mental frame. I mean, that's the thing I really, want to communicate. I mean, what was important, the fact that I decided to write a master's thesis because I had a political interest. Right. And I hadn't thought in my head about a job or anything like that. Just I want to know about this.
Well, I kind of wanted to hear about that. And it sounds like it goes back to Chicago and maybe back further than that. In terms of you wanting to study something because you're on the left and you're an activist and you're involved in these issues. It sounds like the civil rights movement was an entryway for you, but
well, it was, and also University of Chicago also from '63 to '67. These were all times of tremendous ferment. And
well, when did Martin Luther King come and do the housing?
Martin Luther King did that in the summer of 1966.
Right, okay.
And that's always actually been a formative experience, which I share whenever I get to be teaching this, because so he had these housing marches. Yeah. And, it's sort of a riot now that, he's a hero in Chicago. But when he went there in '66, Mayor Daley, wanted to destroy him. So he had these marches, and they became unbelievably violent. And so one of them, they were going on, day after day. And I was in Chicago that summer trying to not fail biology, which I was in danger of doing and never graduating. But anyway, I decided to go on one of these marches. And it was the most terrifying experience that I have ever had.
I can imagine. And for those listening, that this is in Eyes on the Prize. There's an episode and this is the only footage I've ever seen of this, and this is why I bring it up, because I knew you were around for it, and I suspected you might have been there. But it is the most insane outburst of hatred aimed at Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization on the streets.
But one reason I've mentioned too that when I'm teaching courses and this period or this issue comes up, I always cite my own experience for one particular reason, which is that it was so terrifying. I wasn't do it if. I went to one, and I never went again. And, I think a lot of times when people study the civil rights movement and you see the bravery of people, but you just kind of imagine, oh, yeah, well, they made brave people back then.
Right.
But actually, I'm sure there were half the people that ever went were like me, which is, it's like, this is too scary. I can't do it.
Yeah.
Which, in a sense, highlights, what other people were willing to do.
Well, what was scary about it?
People were crazy. So Martin Luther King was going into these white neighborhoods in Chicago and, focusing on discrimination in housing. Mm-hmm. And the level of rage in those communities was just out of control. I mean, first of all, one thing I couldn't even understand is there were these women standing in front of their houses in house coats at noon.
Yeah.
So partly I'm thinking, why are you in your house coat at noon? What's up with that? And they're screaming.
Yeah.
They're screaming, and there are what felt. I'm sure it was exaggerated in my mind, these young men with motorcycles and Confederate flags and swastikas. And it was interesting because there was a march, and in this particular, unlike the South, we were walking two abreast. Mm-hmm. And on either side of us were police, were Chicago police. And I remember I was paired with a black woman who looked to be about 80, right? Who, as far as I could tell, was totally unfazed and calm.
Right.
And she could see that I'm like this total chicken. So she keeps saying, don't look to your side, just look straight ahead. Mm. And incredibly, while we're walking, and again, we have police here. So this isn't like Alabama, Mississippi. And people are throwing bottles and bricks, and things are flying through the air. And the other part was that I actually had heard on the radio earlier before I went that it was thought that some people had guns. Mm-hmm. And I remember just marching and thinking, trying to follow this 80-year-old woman who was telling me, I think I'm 20 years old at that point, be brave. And I'm trying to not think about the fact that we could get shot.
Sure. And
we're going straight ahead. But I think I became so acutely aware of my back the whole time. But it was really...
being shot would have been a real possibility during that era. It feels like the civil rights movement was a target for that kind of stuff all the time.
Well, more in the South. I don't think anybody ultimately got shot in the King marches, but the level of anger that was there was really something I had never experienced. And, the closest that it could come was what we saw on the television in, southern communities when people were trying to integrate the schools. But again, Martin Luther King came into Chicago in a context where there was an ongoing movement, which I had been part of, not a huge part, but CORE had been really focused on integrating the schools of Chicago, which were very segregated.
And why CORE, which is what Congress on Racial Equality? Right. Why is that the organization you were involved with? And I think some people might ask, well, why not SNCC? What were you involved with SNCC, or what was the difference of the organizations to you?
Well, first of all, there was on campus there was a CORE chapter. There wasn't a SNCC chapter. The other thing is that SNCC was more focused on the South. Mm-hmm. So there were people from SNCC coming in and out all the time. And there were people. In general, from the Southern movement that were coming to campus to recruit, to share their experiences. Right. So they were around. There was, in terms of the surrounding community, I'm trying to remember, the movement was I think it was the Woodlawn Organization. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there was, indigenous civil rights entity that was working on the school issue. And people on our campus who wanted to work with them were being organized through Campus CORE. That was the reason for it. It wasn't, a choice of 6 different organizations. If you wanted to be involved in the integration thing in the city, and you were a student, That was the entree
there.
to do
yeah,
that.
no, I was
right.
curious how that happened. I mean, can we go back a little further and kind of understand, how did you come to be concerned with those kinds of issues? Were you raised in a family that was left-wing, or were there teachers in your family? When did politics enter your world?
I think for my mother,
Yeah.
tried to indoctrinate me about Henry Wallace by giving me like good cereal for Henry Wallace and bad cereal for Harry Truman.
Wow.
that may have originated when I was 3. But my family was kind of mixed. My mother was a little more left. My father was a Democratic county committee man. And my parents, to some extent, there was core at some point in suburban New Jersey where I grew up.
Okay.
So I had done that. I can't really tell you why I was political. I mean, just I was, and I finally, by accident, my parents made a mistake and they sent me to a kind of a communist camp. I don't think they understood that was what it was.
This has come up on this show before, people being sent to communist and socialist camps, and they weren't sure what it was, and after a while they figured it out.
Well, it was funny. I mean, somehow I had in my head the town that I grew up in has changed tremendously, but I had it in my head that I should go to an integrated camp. I was 14 years old. And what happened was, so there weren't that many of those integrated camps, as it turns out. So my parents said, oh, your cousin, he goes to an integrated camp. Why don't you go to your cousin's camp? So I thought, that's fine. And nobody seemed alerted to the fact, of how radical a place this was.
Yeah.
And so I arrived there, and there are all these other teenagers who've been going there for years. And, some amount of people have family in jail. Some of them seem to have been called up before HUAC. I'm like, where am I here? Right. And then so I remember, because my father worked for Shell Oil Company as an executive. And I remember somebody in my bunk saying, oh, what does your dad do? Where does he work? And I said, oh, my father works for Shell Oil Company. And she immediately said, oh, he must be organizing the oil workers. And I think, no.
Wow.
But so it took me like a little bit of time to like understand where I was.
Yeah.
But then, it was great, actually, because the ideals that were being espoused were, very positive ones, both in terms of issues of peace, issues of social justice, issues of civil rights, being a decent person, being active, not passive. These were all really good things.
It's almost like a civics lesson.
Right. And I don't want to get too deep in this, but one of the effects of being in this camp, right, is that I happened to be editor of my junior high newspaper. And so I returned
I'm seeing so many connections here.
And so I returned from comic camp to be editor of my junior high school newspaper, and I'm just full of great ideas. So let's just say that before that string ran out, I was in deep trouble. I ceased to be editor. My mother, who was working for the school system, got fired. It became like a huge case. And really what it was about, which does have some historical interest, because this is still, the end of the 50s.
Yeah.
And the McCarthy period. And so there was a tremendous fear on the part of school administrators, school teachers, about anything that sounded radical. So I remember from that time you'll see how crazy this was. I did I wrote an editorial about that we should support UNICEF. It doesn't seem like right, and they censored it.
Wow.
They wouldn't let me.
Even that is too radical.
Right. And that really tells you something interesting about the time that we were living in. So anyway, that whole set of experiences was also, for me, a learning experience. But, again, it's a certain amount of...
Did you come home and confront your dad about why he wasn't organizing the workers?
Well, he couldn't organize it as an executive of Shilla. No. I didn't. But, I think going to camp that summer and meeting other young people that were interested in things. And read books and wanted to be useful people in the world. These were all great.
It sounds like it wasn't necessarily a radicalizing experience, but more of just a learning experience.
Well, it was really both.
Yeah.
Because I think, I mean, on the one hand, you know, like, why is my counselor from East Berlin?
East Berlin, yeah.
Why are these various people have been to China when no one's allowed to go to China? There was all these interesting characters that are floating through. And so there was a lot of learning about all of that, and learning from, you know, fellow campers about, you know, what their lives were like and what had happened to their parents. You know, these were things I didn't know. But I think it was radicalizing because I think it, you know, the whole idea, I mean, we celebrated Fidel Castro.
That's radical. Yeah.
Right. So, you know, I think a whole bunch of those things was very significant.
So when you get to the university, what school were you at in Chicago?
I went to the University of Chicago.
And what were you thinking? I mean, it sounds like you're a type of person who was kind of wanted to study your interest rather than kind of being career-minded about it.
Well, you know, it's interesting. At the University of Chicago, and, you know, everybody has opinions about that. University of Chicago at that time, you know, that the overlying, sort of the ethos of the place was really apolitical. It was very focused on, you know, studying the great books. You know, Aristotle had an opinion on everything. We got to learn all about Aristotle.
Right.
It was a very intellectual place. And it was a funny place. I mean, it's actually interesting. It was a funny place because it had a ton of left-wing students from New York. And that was, you know, that was what they seemed to specialize at. And what's interesting, and a little buried piece of history, okay, is that the people at Chicago who were committed to a general education, to the liberal arts, to studying the classics, they were under attack, not by left people. They were under attack by other faculty who were more interested in, you know, kind of professionalization in the behavioral sciences and gathering data and publishing things, and, you know, no, you don't just look to Aristotle to find out, you know, about politics. You know? But they wanted the school to be more traditional, like more like other schools.
Okay.
And so oddly, when I first came to Chicago, the students that were more left-wing actually were supporters of the more classical approach to education.
That's funny.
This is a piece of history that's totally buried.
Yeah.
Right? And you might say, well, why is that true? And I'll just give you one reason for it, which resonates in many different ways, which is that for the most part, the professors that had this kind of old-fashioned, this idea of, you know, studying the classics and intellectual life for its own sake and the life of the mind. The thing about these people was that they were interested in students. And they were really committed teachers. And they weren't necessarily rushing to publish in every last journal in the world. You know, they could pore over, you know, Plato's Republic for 10 years. But they wanted students to learn that stuff. And so those were the kind of people that would come to your apartment, that would hold events.
I romanticize this era.
Right. Worked on weekends.
Yeah.
So
tweed jackets and all that.
So oddly, when I first came there, you know, and was kind of being, you know, greeted by, you know, upper class left-wing students.
Sure.
That was where the loyalty was.
That's really interesting.
And we really supported it. And, you know, one name that I don't know if the people who are listening are going to really recognize this was a man by the name of Wayne Booth, who's actually very, very well-known proponent of liberal education. I mean, he's dead now, and very, you know, fine, first-rate literature scholar, and very conservative. And Wayne Booth became dean of the college. And so there's this really interesting moment. He becomes the dean of the college, and he decides that all classes should be canceled for 3 days so that the whole community can discuss what kind of knowledge is worth having. Okay.
What kind of knowledge is worth having? Yeah.
3 days to this, right? He cancels class. And many, many other faculty of the kind of people that are, like, you know, publishing in journals and wanting to be, you know, very specialized in this or that, they're, like, crazed by this. Like, what is he doing? Why are we canceling 3 days? All the kids are going to go home. Okay. And so Wayne Booth reached out to student organizations like Campus Corps and Left Wing Group to help him with this.
That is so funny.
Right? And we did.
Yeah.
And we worked really hard, with the various left organizations to really make sure that students would stay on campus, not go home, participate in the panels. We did all this activity. So that was and there were close personal relationships. I'm building to. There's an end to this story.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm just because I'm just thinking about.
You'll never hear.
No, I mean, when you think of like the left and academia, particularly post 60s. I do not think of proponents of classical education. I think of it instead as going in the direction of like studying postmodernism and deconstructionism and moving the whole academic project into wackier territory.
Right. Well, that hadn't happened yet.
Right.
And there's reasons why you don't make that association. But in any case, it was very clear that if you were a student in any of a whole variety of left organizations on campus. During my first 3 years at the University of Chicago, we really saw ourselves as protectors and enthusiasts of those professors who really had this kind of old-fashioned idea about what an education should be. However, the Vietnam War devastated those connections. And at the University of Chicago, the turning point was very specific, which is that there was a point at which the Selective Service was asking universities to compile class ranks with the purpose of saying that young men who were in the bottom half of the class would lose their student deferment. And Chicago, like most other places, never had a class rank. I mean, you did that in high school. You don't have class ranks, whatever. But the university, immediately, Selective Service wants us to have a class rank, we're going to do it. So they're ready to collaborate. But of course, for students, this is absolutely horrifying for every possible reason, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you just, what, if a young man has a C+ average,
it's insane.
It's outrageous. And not to mention that it's certainly any notion that you have of a community of scholars is going to be seriously upended if the authorities in your community are sending you off to the draft board and maybe to go to Vietnam.
So it's not just disagreement over the war that's causing this split you're talking about. It's actually bodies on the line.
Right. It's like and it wasn't that we were saying working class people should go. I mean, our position was nobody should be forced to go because this war is terrible. But over and above that, the notion that the university would actually collude in identifying which of its students should become eligible to lose their deferments, it was like so outrageous.
Yeah. What a power. So that set off university sit-ins. Okay, which we occupied the administration building. So this would have been in 1966. Okay, yeah.
Okay, 65, 66.
Because it's 65 and 66. I mean, for those that aren't as familiar with the history of the Vietnam War, 65 is really the moment where the big escalation happens in the summer of 65. There are a couple 100,000 troops, I think 150,000, something like that, in Vietnam, and the war is really beginning. And also the anti-war movement is starting on college campuses in terms of teach-ins and that kind of stuff, and it sounds like that's what's going on in Chicago.
Well, so it's starting. So that was really. It was the sit-ins were actually in the spring of 1966.
Okay.
And occupied the administration building, and it felt like it went on forever. And people were reading, people were learning things. There were hundreds of students in the administration building. That particular demonstration in Chicago actually set off demonstrations around the country. And I remember, phone calls would come in, okay, Wisconsin is out, the school is out. It was really great. And that one reason you never heard of this stupid policy is because there was such strong protest against it of class rank that they actually retreated, not the university, but the selective
It's just
service.
incredible to me that there were protests that were so strong happening on college campuses that they were actually making impact all around the country. And there's no internet at all to get this started.
No, I was thinking about that because I have this very distinct memory of sitting in on the administration building in Chicago and having, there was phones that people were manning and then again, these dramatic announcements would come. You know, Madison has 2,000 people in the, you know, whatever, and so it was like this.
It's such a different
whole
scene,
generational excitement. But what was really interesting was that these professors that we all admired and respected and had relationships with and had helped in their crisis of what kind of knowledge was worth having, they were terrible. They were absolutely terrible. And there was no understanding. I mean, the just dull-wittedness of, like, both an inability to grasp anybody's moral concerns about the Vietnam War.
Wow.
Right, on the one hand, and also an inability to understand why, why this possibly this idea of doing a class rank, why that would possibly disrupt the community of scholars. Like
why they didn't even get that.
Why would that be a problem?
Yeah.
They couldn't get it. So that was a stunning experience, and I have two sort of memories from then, which could be made up, but anyway, this is what they are. The one person of this type who seemed to have understood something about this was Hannah Arendt, who came into the buildings when they were occupied. And I feel like she was there, and, you know, she left saying, well, why doesn't anybody see that they're building community right here? They're learning things, they're discussing things. So that was great. The other, you know...
she has a wider view.
In that particular case, right? She was able to, like, get that.
Right.
But in general, the people that we all had relationships with did not. And I particularly remember James Redfield. I don't know if that's a name. He's a very, very well-known classical scholar.
Yeah.
And again, one of those super teachers that everybody loved, that, you know, took him 12 times and went to his house. And I can remember James Redfield coming to the building and pulling out the students that he knew and pleading with them to leave the building, you know, and being incredibly upset. And so that was a very big moment, I think, you know, both in terms of for many of us and also for the institution itself.
Yeah, and I mean, not just the institution of University of Chicago, but the story that you just told kind of, like, for me, sounds like there's so much that's what people talk about with the 60s, like the generation gap, and it's kind of like these rambunctious kids that rebelled against the older authority. And it sounds like, I mean, that's certainly invested in the story you just told, but there's a substance to it. You know, the specific substance at the University of Chicago is tied to the Vietnam War directly. It's not just young people not liking the older people. There's something really deep going on there.
Well, there was something deep, but the non-comprehension, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that really, from that time on, it's not like everything changed, you know, in a minute.
Right.
But you then had an evolution of events, you know, that got worse. And in a lot of ways. And relationships that had been, you know, pretty positive were really damaged. And I always remember particularly, you know, just one, I mean, and things got more polarized about politics. But as I said, they got polarized about politics, but they also destroyed, you know, the particular loyalties that had existed, you know, before. And I always remember... whole networks of people, it seems like, are going to lose each other in moments like that. People are going to lose each other, and people are also going to evolve. You know, in various ways politically. I mean, then, you know, there's many different people's stories involved. But the thing I always remember the most, that to this day, if I ever finish my Vietnam book, I'm going to write about it, is this one specific example of my friend Jeff, who I remember Jeff, age 19, as the person sitting with me in a meeting with Wayne Booth. And Jeff saying, we're going to do this. We're going to get you, I can tell you, we're going to get students to stay. This is going to work. This is a great idea. Right. And Jeff taking all his organizational skills and, you know, putting them to work for Wayne Booth's conference. Wow. And 2 years later, Wayne Booth threw him out of the University of Chicago.
Yeah, that's insane.
Right.
That
I mean, there were reasons.
You go from that to that over the war.
Right. And
I feel like I don't want to move to Trump at all right now, but I feel like you reach moments like this where people's politics evolve very, very rapidly, it seems like. And it seems like in the 60s, the politics were very chaotic, and you had people shooting off in all kinds of different directions like that. And you're bound to have both professional and personal relationships just destroyed by it.
Right, and I always remember Jeff, but that was very particular because Jeff was so wonderful in helping this dean, and and he was fun, and he was energetic, and he was thrown out of college, and he's done fine for himself, but in life, but many decades later, he wrote to Wayne Booth, and he said he'd like to get together and talk.
Wow.
And Wayne Booth never answered him.
Wow. Well,
it's just incredible.
It does go deep.
And what's ironic is that it's from the University of Chicago more than almost any other place that you get this lie about how the left killed the liberal arts, right? That the insistence on relevance is what destroyed intellectual inquiry. Mm-hmm. So that is the thing I'm going to write when I finish my book. Is that's such a distortion, of what happened, and a really profound misunderstanding.
Well, I mean, let's move back to graduate school. I mean, it sounds like did you decide to go to graduate school right out of undergrad?
Yes, I did.
And what was going? It sounds like you started at Columbia at 67. You said?
Yes.
Okay. So I mean, that's another hotbed of radical activity going on. Were you involved in any of that in any of the strike, or are you just kind of like there and? I mean, I kind of wonder how you get a PhD when there's that much chaos going on a campus.
Well, one thing is you get your master's thesis accepted as your doctoral dissertation, and it'll speed you on your way.
But you're still, I mean, those 4 years, 67 and 71, are some of the most intense years at Columbia, certainly, and some of the most intense years at college campuses in American history.
That's true. And I'm going to come back, David, to your question about, I was very active. I was on the strike steering committee. We then had a graduate student union, which at one point I was co-chair of with my friend Danny Pope. But I actually want to just to capture something of the times for especially listeners that are not, as old as me. I'm going to tell one little anecdote from my experience as a graduate student. So I, like every other graduate student, I'm like a nervous wreck about orals, right? Mm-hmm. And I study for 9 months, 10 months, locked in the library with all my friends. Orals were a huge thing at Columbia.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I'm supposed to take them something like May 7th or something like that. So on April 30th, 1970, Nixon announces that he's invading Cambodia. Mm-hmm. Okay, and here my orals are like in 7 or 8 days.
Oh, wow.
And the graduate students start meeting, and I happen to be co-chair of the graduate union, and we develop this whole activism project that we want to do. So now I'm like confronted with this problem, which is I'm supposed to take my orals in like 8 days. And I'm co-chair of this student union. Like, how exemplary will it be for me to be sitting in the library studying?
Right. That's not what college is for. You're supposed to be active.
So I called up Richard Hofstadter, who is the chair of my committee, and I said, look, you know what? I'm not going to take my orals. I'll do them in September. And he said, why? And I said, because I'm going to be active in another hour.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to study at all.
Yeah.
And I need the studying. And, so I'll do it in September. So
put it off till the fall semester.
Put it off till the fall.
Sure.
So here's the sign of the times. Sometime afterwards, like in the next day, Hofstadter called me back. And he said, look, he said, you know what? Take your orals. If you have to go off and do all your activities, go do your activities. And you'll take your orals. And you won't lose anything by it. If you fail them, you can take them in September, but you've been working on this throughout the year, and maybe it'll come out okay. Yeah. So we'll all know that you're not going to study, and let's do it
Let's
that
see what
way.
happens. Yeah.
Right. This is graduate school, 1968.
Yeah.
Now, as it happened, what actually ended up happening was that, sadly, Richard Hofstadter had leukemia.
That's right. Yeah.
And
I mean, he was young when he died.
Right, and he had, between that time, that phone call and my orals, he had a sudden medical emergency and he was hospitalized.
Okay. Wow.
So he actually ended up not being there. And I think Eric Foner, who was then maybe very junior himself, got put on the committee.
Wow. These are big names. These are names that have come up on this show, and Foner was on this show in one of the early episodes.
So Eric is on the committee, and there's 4 people. And really, my orals were terrible. I couldn't answer anything.
But you passed?
And I'm looking at Eric. I have this picture of Eric sitting in the room and desperately trying to think of like some question that I could answer right, so I wouldn't look like a
softball.
Right. Yeah. And Eric McKittrick was very conservative but very lovely man. He's also doing the same. Everybody's looking. Surely she must be able to answer something. And so, to me, I think of it as who discovered America?
Yeah,
right. Who was our first president? Oh,
wow.
George Washington. So I passed.
Nice.
But truthfully, it was a gift of God.
Yeah.
It was. But I wanted to tell that story, David,
That's amazing,
because
though. What a room too.
It conveys whatever.
Yeah, all of that happening at the same time. And I mean, Kent State feels like it would happen at the same time as your orals, too.
It did happen. And there was also tremendous solidarity. I mean, the other little item I didn't mention is when I was taking my orals in Fairweather Hall, my fellow graduate students, I had like a whole posse of friends that were all right there, while I took my orals, and so I felt incredibly supported by people. I'm sure my orals committee felt incredibly discouraged from failing me because of it's really the mood of the time.
Intersections there. That's funny.
But truthfully, I didn't deserve to get a PhD. I should go back and do it again.
Well, you're not alone. I think there are a lot of people that don't deserve PhDs that got them, and that's just the way it works. I mean. Well, after you get your PhD, you at what point? I mean, isn't the Mayday Tribe? I want to bring that up because there's something that happens. Is that 71? The Mayday Tribe?
Right, I was in that too.
Okay, and I've read some of your writing on the Mayday Tribe, and it's just something that I think a lot of people don't know anything about. It's one of the more intense moments of anti-war activism that's kind of a lost story.
Well, it is a lost story, although truthfully it's less of a story than one could imagine. I had a very odd experience of that. So the Mayday Tribe, for people who are listening and don't immediately know what this is, the Mayday Tribe was a plan in May of 1971 to disrupt the city of Washington. And, it was upping the ante. This war is never going to end.
Yeah. Was there a particular anniversary or something that it was connected to? Or?
Well, they always had demonstrations in April and May. There was an issue because in April of 71 was when the veterans demonstration came to Washington. It's when the medals were turned back. It was when John Kerry testified in the Senate, and the veterans, in fact, did not want their event confused with the Mayday with these other people. So the people who were planning Mayday became Mayday partly so that they would separate from the veterans.
I see. Yeah.
I actually have very complicated feelings about this. Anyway, so, but here, this is like very exciting. We're going to disrupt the city of Washington and, show that the war is coming home. And so there's a lot of excited preparation. We're supposed to be in affinity groups. So we were in affinity group with our friends in graduate school, some other historians, friends that I like to this day. We were the Willis Reed affinity group. And so we were coming to disrupt the city of Washington.
Okay.
And, there was so
using all sorts of revolutionary techniques.
Well, whatever. We have maps. We're all being given maps of like where to disrupt.
Yeah.
And and this is all kind of pre-announced. Remind me that when we get towards the end of this, I want to tell you a story about a family friend whose father worked in the Justice Department who participated in this event.
Okay.
But in any event, so we go, and actually we're picked up immediately by the police en route to Washington. Obviously, they're looking for out-of-state people to just harass. I don't know. They said we were speeding or whatever. But anyway, we arrived safely in Washington. And I think by then, people had maybe been kicked out of the park where they were supposed to be able to stay.
Right. There's something about permits not being granted or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. And again, this was post-veterans.
Yep.
And part of what's interesting is that the participants in Mayday seem to have had little trouble getting housing in all the fanciest places in Washington. Like Georgetown is like filled with,
Why is that? Were they elites? I mean, were they privileged people? Because I feel like the Mayday Tribe has a kind of there's a diverse group of people. It
is a diverse group of people, but again, I mean, this is the way in which Richard Nixon was not totally crazy, right? By 1971, there was a tremendous disaffection from Nixon inside the government, not right. At all levels of the government. People were really fed up with the war. They were fed up with Nixon, whatever. And so, a lot of people were happy to open their houses to protesters, right? And, we had friends, our Willis Reed Affinity Group, we had friends who were pretty wealthy who, I think their house was next to the Laotian embassy or something like that.
Patrons of the left. They kind of let people stay in their house. Yeah.
Barely, because our friends, I mean, actually, the Seth, whose house it was, he really didn't agree with this, and he worked for the Navy.
Yeah.
And was a scientist, so he wasn't happy. And they were even less happy because we, in the Willis Reed Affinity Group, announced that we needed to tear up their sheets in order to make gas masks.
Yeah.
And it turned out their sheets were like pretty expensive. Yeah. So there was a certain amount of pain involved.
We need your 500 thread count sheets to make gas masks because we're going to go try to attack the state tomorrow.
Right. So what was really crazy, so, I mean, honestly, when I look back at this, I think what was in our heads. So Seth is going to go, he's planning to go to work. We're planning, we have our plan. We're going to secretly at 6 a.m. sleep, go down quietly and towards DuPont Circle where we're going to disrupt everything. Okay. So we more or less make it to DuPont Circle. We get to put some logs in the street.
Yeah.
And then we're dispersed. So this is, from my point of view, quite ineffective. However, our host, Seth, got arrested. And it turned out it wasn't just idiosyncratic, because the Washington police were under instructions to sweep up people. And consequently, what happened with that event was that literally thousands of people got arrested who were not demonstrators.
This is the part of the Mayday Tribe story that I wanted to get to. This is the part that I feel like is one of the most significant. It's like the insane repression from the government.
About this, but they had their own people.
All sorts of people up. I mean, this happened during the Republican National Convention in 2004 in New York City, but the scale of it in the Mayday Tribe is intense.
It's intense.
And they took them to a field somewhere.
Right, and they and they were there for like several days.
Yeah, it's awful. It's an insane story.
So right, but I mean, it wasn't so. I mean, we had the particular thing of here we are, the Willis Reed Affinity Group, and we have, ripped up these nice people's sheets for gas masks.
Yeah.
Although we're not really gassed. And meanwhile, our host is like disappears into the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
But thousands of people did. And the thing was, there was such a random quality to this.
I think
and there was a big lawsuit.
Is this one of like the biggest mass arrests in U.S. history? Yeah.
Yes, and there were lawsuits, and eventually people, there were damages that were paid.
Yeah.
So that was, a kind of, I mean, our own role in this was, we put some logs in a street. As a historian, going back and looking at this.
Yes.
What was retrospectively clear to me was how stupid this event was on our part. That, this is kind of like upping the ante in a very, sort of childish way.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really bad about it is that it diluted the impact of the vets.
Yeah.
Because the veterans demonstrations, which had gone on for a week, coupled with Kerry's testimony, was probably the single most devastating thing that happened to the Nixon administration.
I wanted to get to that. From the Nixon perspective, from the perspective of the Nixon White House,
this is terrible.
Yeah, the Winter Soldier and the VVAW coming to Washington seems like it was the worst thing that could possibly happen, because Nixon was working on a public narrative that was kind of the good soldiers versus the bad anti-war movement.
Right. And I think Kerry did, a phenomenal job. I mean, I'm sure, many people have looked at that.
Yeah.
His remarks.
They were
really incredible. And, but also every piece of the day was meaningful. And it even was meaningful, I think, to, not to Richard Nixon, but I think, there were quite a number of senators and congresspeople who came out to talk with the vets during their encampment.
Yeah.
And those exchanges were very important. So this is a really positive development. And having this Mayday thing, Nixon was happy with it,
Yeah, because it played right into his image of anti-war people as just a bunch of jerks that are throwing logs in the street and not really being constructive and being destructive. And it played into the image of just insolent anti-war radicals with no point.
Right, and and I think so. That's when I go back and I look at it, I think really that
you played into it. Yeah,
we really played into it. I think the use of these kinds of tactics reflected the fact that people were frustrated.
Yeah. There's a desperation to them.
But it's interesting. I mean, one of the a lot of attitudes that I had as an activist, back then have been modified by my research as a historian.
Yeah.
And one of the things that sort of hit me, in my old age, is as of the summer of 1969, Richard Nixon was taking troops out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
And he didn't really love doing it. That was his response to political pressure. Mm-hmm. That was very widespread pressure.
Yeah.
And the removal of troops for Nixon and for Kissinger was the indispensable condition for continuing the war. Right? I mean, in other words, if they by taking troops out, they could always say, well, we've just brought it down 50,000 or 60,000. And then they could go on with
buy
this,
them some time. Yeah.
But all it did was buy them time.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact is that by 1972, when you had the Spring Offensive in South Vietnam, there were almost no American combat troops left. And by Election Day 1972, there was maybe like 40,000 U.S. troops, none of whom were really combat troops that were, left in Vietnam. And the thing is that we couldn't appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, every time these increments would be withdrawn, our most powerful reaction was, it's all a trick.
Ah, right.
Right? And it was, I mean, in a way.
Yeah.
Right? But it wasn't in another way. In other words, our protests were actually working.
Right. And
They weren't
it's
working.
tricky, because it's like the withdrawals are happening and they're a show, but they're happening because there's pressure from the anti-war movement for them to happen. Yeah.
That was really, and then we couldn't see that at all.
That's so important. I feel like people are wanting really fast action on things with the Trump administration. They want to confront and get it done, and it feels like if you have the historical point of view, you see that things happen in trickier ways than that.
If it could to fast forward to Iraq.
Yeah.
And it's sort of an interesting parallel. One of the things that during the Iraq War, up until actually just about a minute ago, I was co-coordinator of legislative activity for United for Peace and Justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
working on congressional stuff. Over, and really, especially during, George W. Bush, there was a lot of activity in that way. And as part of that network of people and in those activities, I worked at times pretty closely with Tom Hayden.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that I think he and I both had like this perspective from not from the time, but as we had rethought the 60s.
Yeah.
That we had both come to appreciate that the anti-war movement was having an impact on Congress, whether or not resolutions passed, and therefore having an impact on national policy that we as activists couldn't see then.
Right.
And we both kind of felt that a little bit about Iraq.
Yeah.
That in other words, I mean, in the end, George W. Bush, not Barack Obama, George W. Bush had to sign a status of forces agreement with Iraq.
Right.
And there's a lot of reasons for that, and certainly, Iraqi developments are very important in that. But part of what produced the movement in that direction was the anti-war movement during the Iraq War.
Yeah. Which was a lot bigger than it was during the Obama years, and in terms of just being on the streets. I mean, I know there are a lot of people that are very active on a lot of issues during the Obama years, but the establishment, the anti-war establishment, whatever that is, came out much louder during the Bush years. It felt like I don't know. It feels like I don't know if that will happen during the Trump years too. Because it feels like it's something that's come up on the show is that does having an administration that's antagonistic and right wing and Republican bring out the kind of left activity more than you would find in like a liberal president like Obama?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think the relevant variable is large numbers of troops on the ground.
Yeah, right.
Right, because if you remember, there were, not initially, but ultimately, I think they got up to 160,000 troops in Iraq.
Right. So you think the Bush years are troops on the ground, and the Obama years are people thinking about drone warfare and troops being withdrawn?
Well, except for this, moment at the beginning, where I think Obama is effectively pressured by Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. Not Joe Biden, I'm sorry. Joe Biden was actually wise. But Hillary Clinton and Gates.
Yes, that's right.
To significantly increase the troop numbers in Afghanistan. And so that was one, that the numbers there went up, but partly Obama had conditioned that on a rapid withdrawal.
Right,
so
right.
For most of the Obama years, we haven't had large numbers of troops.
That's right.
And so I think that is like a pretty important factor. But anyway, what I was just wanting to say is that, that Tom Hayden, I think, was driven crazy by feeling that anti-war people in the Iraq era couldn't see that we were actually being somewhat effective.
Well, that's a left's problem always is knowing when they're winning, or recognizing when they're being effective, or claiming victories and moving on and seeing. I mean, that I feel like the right lately has been really good at just kind of like achieving their victories and moving on and kind of like consolidating their power, and the left is very much stuck talking to each other about what happened and why. Well,
yes, although, again, part of the point here is it's such a mixed thing, so, the agitation in Congress and ultimately the election of Barack Obama partly because of his anti-war views.
Yeah, right.
Right. I mean, that, then in conjunction with developments inside Iraq, created this outcome. But the problem is, and the situation in Vietnam is a little bit different, is it's very hard to look at Iraq at any point since the invasion and feel good about it, right? I mean, the American responsibility for what we have done to that country is just
insane.
Unbelievable.
It's staggering.
So it's not really easy, to say, well, we got a lot of troops out and we feel great about it. I mean,
right.
It's not really a cause for celebration. And in fact, one of the, to my mind, really tragic things that's present now, is that most Americans are really oblivious to what we've done in Iraq.
Yeah.
And, when these stories appear, which barely do, about, like what's going on in Mosul, now,
It's a nightmare.
Which is a nightmare, but it's actually a nightmare for, a very small amount of Americans who think about it.
Yeah.
And even for people thinking about it, the temptation is, well, that's ISIS.
Sure.
Whatever. So, I think for millions of Americans, our responsibility for what happened in Iraq is completely hidden. For anti-war activists, people who participated over those years, again, it's hard to feel so great about, even accomplishing, okay, so we got the troops out, but we're back. It's a mixed thing. And similarly, with Vietnam, as it's a mixed story. But I think there's no question that the tremendous amount of organizing that went on forced Nixon to take growing numbers of troops out of Vietnam, which he did not want to do. He needed to do it politically. And ultimately it meant that the United States had to leave the war. And that really was, in my view, an achievement of the anti-war movement. But I think we didn't see it at the time. I think we're just so furious.
Well, just reading the transcripts or listening to the Nixon tapes, you get the idea that, the anti-war movement was a constituency that Nixon felt he had to answer to, a powerful constituency that he didn't want to admit in public that was what was shaping his policies. But in private, he was terrified of the anti-war movement.
Well, he was, and particularly, and this is actually another place where my experience as a historian has influenced my later life. Activism. He was very worried about Congress.
Yeah.
And
they were passing resolutions that were limiting his ability to wage war.
Well, they passed some, but the bigger, restricting his ability to use ground troops in Laos and Cambodia after the invasion. But there was always the possibility. That partly what was driving policy was that you had the possibility that Congress would cut off the funds.
Right.
And so how do you avoid that? Well, you avoid that by taking another 50,000 out or another 70,000 out and so forth. But it meant that Congress was always, Nixon had a term for it. He said, we're always one step ahead of the sheriff. So, Congress was a more important player in this than at the time.
Right,
I everyone I knew hated Congress too.
And they don't want to deal with it at all. No, I think you've impressed that upon me in other conversations we've had. The kind of importance of the stuff that the left often finds kind of boring, or either they find it boring or they just find it the machine of fascism, so they don't want to deal with it at all. But the government is really the only levers you have against power like that.
Well, that's right, and again, it's I think it wasn't until I started reading classified documents.
Yeah, right.
And looking at how decisions were getting made, back then, and again, especially in that latter phase, I don't know that Lyndon Johnson was terribly worried about Congress.
Yeah, right.
I think for Lyndon Johnson, what became decisive was the impact of the anti-war movement was having on the electoral campaign.
Right. His ability to win as president.
Right.
Another term, yeah. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I promised that we would talk about the historical discipline a little bit, because I know you have some issues with how that's changed. And for me, I didn't really get into the discipline of history until the 2000s. So you have to catch me up a little bit. What is it that's changed in history for you?
Well, it's not what's changed for history. There's a sort of other buried part of sort of left graduate student organizing that was important to me.
Yeah.
Which is that. First of all, at Columbia, as a result of the strike of '68, there really became a strong graduate student organization, and friendships. I still have lots of my friends from that time. You probably still have some from,
sure.
From your time.
Of course.
But political activity brought people together. And as one aspect of it, there was a feeling that that one area of change that was important is that we wanted our profession to change.
Yeah, yeah.
And in some ways, our generation, I think, was very effective in doing that. And I think that has more to do with, looking at history not just as a study of elites, right, but as, a more inclusive history that's not just, white men, that's not just about high politics. I mean, all the things that
Sure.
That people thought it important to have a much wider lens, to be more interested.
All those things became hallmarks of the way history is taught now.
Right, and and these are all very significant achievements. Now, to some extent, just on that point, just to be a curmudgeon, I think it's gone too far in the sense that I think that one of the effects of staying away from powerful white men is that things like the study of foreign policy or the history of American foreign policy or of U.S. military policy has been left to a large extent by much more centrist people. And that left graduate students have stayed away from these areas. The consequence is that we actually have like a missing generation almost.
Right.
That
makes
people
sense.
Really, which is really unfortunate, especially because, powerful white men continue to have a significant influence on what happens in the world. So,
Sure.
I actually think that's a real unfortunate byproduct.
Yeah,
that's not an
that's
argument.
really interesting. It's like there's kind of in the same way that the left doesn't, has a skepticism about engaging with, the state or the government in that way, the Congress. An academic skepticism about engaging with foreign policy or military issues, and that leaves it to people, like in the center or the right, to tell that story.
Right, and actually, one of the ways that I'm being driven crazy this week is that you're hearing this endless thing about the Russians intervening in elections.
Sure.
When all these news people act like this is like the most heinous crime ever.
Right.
But in actuality, of course, the United States has been intervening in elections, for a century. And many of the things that they say with horror that the Russians did, we do all the time.
Right.
But there's no voice saying that. And part of it, in my view, is because there's such weakness on the academic side that there's so few authoritative people, who have background history, for example, to, come forward and offer this broader perspective. And so it's totally absent.
Right.
And again, that's not just, because of our profession, it's because of the media, but the truth is there's really been a lack. So that's one of my disappointments. I think the other disappointment that I have is that I feel like one of the, to me, valuable aspects of the 60s was thinking differently about education and the role of a professor. And, at Columbia, we were always mad at our professors because, they mostly were inaccessible and, interested in their own projects. And,
Sure.
Maybe they paid attention to grad students. Their undergraduates were grossly neglected in that, in that period. So there was a model of kind of functioning as a professor in which teaching itself would, number one, be much more experimental, and also would have a higher value than research.
Yeah.
And I think that, to a large extent, that's gotten lost.
Definitely.
It's not gotten lost for everybody. But to a significant degree, folks from my generation have gone on to really reinforce some of the norms that I think we once recognized as pretty objectionable. And, when I think about this just in terms of publication, my own personal view is that I feel like I would love to have colleagues who are really great teachers. And if they happen to publish and have that as a thing that they do and they invest significantly in it, that's a plus. But to me, it's really far less important than somebody who has the ability to work with our particular students and to really reach them and excite them and so forth. But I see that in most places, that the norm is, what's your book project, and what are your plans for your next 5 projects, and so you have these articles, and and then it kind of gets justified. Well, we have to do that because otherwise they'll get rejected by the dean. But I think that once upon a time we had the idea that teaching, first of all, teaching a broad range of kinds of people with diverse techniques really mattered, and that the most important priority in a college ought to be teaching. And I really think that's been lost.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, and it's something that comes up on the show a lot. Is kind of like the way that teaching has been decentered as the kind of primary academic experience, and teaching becoming this kind of work-a-day thing that adjuncts are doing, just kind of like teaching 5 classes as fast as they can, not having time to do anything. I mean, the university has structured itself in a way that has made teaching into a factory-like experience. And there's a long history to that, but I'm with you 100%, and that something is lost when the professor's role is not centering teaching and touching, really, like, I don't know, touching the hearts and minds of young people is really, I do have that romantic vision, of the life of the mind, everything. My wife calls it the 1947 vision, that I have this vision of like, smoking a pipe somewhere in some East Coast, campus, talking to students. But that's really is like, for me, that Dead Poet Society thing, that's like, that I'm with you. And the whole, I agree that, research and publishing is great, and I think that those activities are an important part of what academics do, but not as important as training the next generation. And not only training, but just, I don't know. There's something mystical about the teacher-student relationship that I feel like is lost when it gets devalued in the way that you're talking about.
I mean, it really is devalued. I mean, if you look what's happened to CUNY, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean,
well, that's where I'm at.
That's where you're at, right? Yeah. And increasingly, I mean, so much of CUNY is being run by adjuncts.
Yeah.
But even in my own university, which is a private university, when I came there were 5 full-time American historians. As of this minute, I am the only full-time American historian,
the discipline,
which is ridiculous.
For those that don't know, that the discipline is disappearing in terms of full-time tenure-track jobs. I mean, they're just not there, especially in U.S. history, but in the whole historical discipline. And I mean, this is something that's happening, I think, across the humanities.
Right.
But either way, it's weird, because I feel like the next generation of academics will all be, cobbling together part-time positions rather than really having full-time. There's just not enough. There are not enough jobs.
But there are not enough jobs.
Yeah.
But again, I think there really is this second aspect, which is really what is the hierarchy of values that you have.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that one of the hopeful aspects of thinking in the 1960s about education was really that you would really make teaching the centerpiece of what you do, because that's, after all, kids are paying money, or their parents are, and then you could do other things, but that really was the primary mission. And I don't think, and I include other leftists in this, I don't think that our generation has done an adequate job of protecting that ideal. Yeah, there are many individual exceptions to what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
right?
I know there are.
But collectively, I think this is a part of our, hope for the future that really somehow got lost.
It's a legacy I'd like to bring back. Carolyn Eisenberg, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Carolyn Eisenberg. I always have a great time listening to her. I hope you did too. You can find more Nostalgia Trap conversations and subscribe to the show at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. You can subscribe, throw me a few dollars, and I'll send you some stuff in the mail. And I've got bonus episodes coming for subscribers as well. So thank you as always. See you next time.